Hello, and welcome to True Crime Time. This program is brought to you every second Thursday of the month from the St. Joseph Public Library, and it is organized by Downtown Library Branch Manager Jen Wildhagen. I am Jennifer Sanders-Tutt, the local history librarian for the St. Joseph Public Library, and today we will be talking about H.H. Holmes, American serial killer. H.H. Holmes was a prolific serial killer at the turn of the 20th century. His life and his murders are surrounded in myth and legend. So when I was researching this, it was difficult to wade through all the information to sort out what was apocryphal and what was factual, what actually occurred within his lifetime. What you will hear today is a mix of widely accepted facts about his life, information that has been researched by others and is generally believed to be true, and what I could find in historic newspapers. So we will pick up when H.H. Holmes was not yet H.H. Holmes, but Herman Webster Mudgett, born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was the second of three children, born into a farming family, and it was said that his father was a violent alcoholic, and Holmes was abused. And in this, I will be referring to him as Holmes, just so it's not confusing, because he does go by other pseudonyms throughout his life. And not only was Holmes abused by his father, it's said that he was bullied in school as a child. The other kids did really horrible things to him. And when looking back on his life, when researchers and psychologists tried to apply the modern serial killer model to Holmes, they believed that he tortured animals when he was younger. Holmes gets married at a very young age, 17, to Clara Lovering, and shortly thereafter has a child with her. There are accounts of him taking up the profession of school teacher before he decides to leave that behind and go on to college and medical school. So he takes Clara with him and bounces around a few different colleges in the Northeast before he lands in Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. This is in 1882, and Clara had followed him and gone with him, but the house that he was living in, he had housemates, and their accounts describe Holmes as treating Clara very violently, and eventually she leaves him and goes back to New Hampshire, and they never really see each other again. And Holmes's relationships with women will play a big part in his narrative throughout his life. So as I said, in 1882, he's at Michigan, and he stays there until 1884 when he graduates. During that time, he works in the anatomy lab under a Professor HERDMAN. Prior to this, when he was still in New Hampshire, he studied under a Dr. NAHUM WIGHT, and Dr. WIGHT was a noted advocate for human dissection and actively practiced it. And it's during this time that Holmes comes up with one of his first fraud schemes. He conspires with a friend of his who's also a medical student to fake the friend's death and turn it in for insurance money. The friend had just taken out a policy on himself. After he graduates from medical school, he moves around a lot. One of the first places he goes to is Moores Forks, New York. And it's not long before he's there that he is suspected of murdering a young boy. And so once the people in the town get suspicious, he up and leaves. He then goes on to Philadelphia, where he works in a drugstore. And the same kind of thing happens. He sells a little boy medicine, and the boy dies after ingesting it. On top of Holmes's kind of erratic moving around the United States and the mysterious events that followed him, he was also a serial bigamist. He had multiple marriages throughout his life, and none of them were really legal, probably except for the first one. As I had mentioned, he was married to a woman named Clara Lovering, and she left him when he was in medical school to go back to New Hampshire because he treated her badly. And it's said that he tried to divorce her, but didn't really have a lot of follow-through for it. The paperwork was never actually served to her, probably, and so he just kind of dropped the matter. Well, we know of at least two other marriages that he was said to have had. One was with a woman named Myrta Belknap, and this was in Chicago. He actually ends up having a daughter with her in 1889. And another was a woman named Georgina Yoke in 1894. And this was while he was still married to Clara and Myrta. He gets married to Georgina in Denver. In 1886, Holmes moves to Chicago, and it's then that he assumes the name H.H. Holmes. There are varying stories on whether it was Henry Howard Holmes or Harry Howard Holmes, and he may have even gone back and forth between the names. He gets a job at a drugstore in the Englewood area of Chicago, and it's owned by a woman named Elizabeth Holton and her husband, and he works his way up and is a really good employee, and eventually ends up buying the business from Holton and her husband. There were rumors later on that he had murdered the Holtons, but those are disproven. Eventually, he ends up buying the property right across the street from the drugstore, and it's there that he begins construction on what will become known as his murder castle. Construction began in 1887, and it was to be a mixed-use building. Eventually, it would span the entire block that it sat on. And the first floor was devoted to retail space and a drugstore. And then the second floor was apartments. Later on, in 1892, he began adding a third floor. He claims that this third floor is in preparation for the upcoming Columbian Exposition, or what is a World's Fair. And it's to take place in 1893, the following year. And he says it's going to be a hotel for that purpose, because he knows lots of people will be coming into the city and looking for places to stay. A little bit of background on the Columbian Exposition. This was Chicago's chance to show that it had come back from the Chicago fire that had decimated the city in 1871. When construction on the Columbian Exposition was completed, it consisted of over 200 buildings and covered more than 690 acres. It opened on May 1st, 1893, and lasted until October 30th of that year. It was marketed as a spectacle of art, science, and industry, and they spent about $1.5 million constructing it. In today's money, that's almost $42 million. It was constructed in the Beaux Arts style, and all the materials were carefully chosen, and so when it was completed, every building had a white facade, and thus it became known as the White City. However, Holmes' World's Fair Hotel was never completed. If you look at photos of the building, the third story doesn't actually have a roof on it. And it's the process of construction on this third floor that draws him a lot of unwanted attention. He had a bad habit of getting contractors and construction companies to come in and begin work on the building when he never had any intention of paying them for that work. He was also notorious for hiding their construction materials. And it's later found out that he would hide them in the maze of hallways and rooms that were on the third floor. He also runs the same scam with furniture. He actually tries to furnish the third floor, whether it was just for the money or if he was actually intending to try and open it as a hotel. But on March 31st, the Chicago Tribune runs an article entitled Hidden Secret Rooms, where dealers discover their missing furniture. And it talks about how all of these different high-end furniture companies, also linens and china, these companies realize that he has been swindling them. He's been ordering on account using fake business names, fake names himself, and he would order furniture and all of these goods and have them delivered and promise payment when they're delivered. And then he would come up with a reason why he couldn't pay them. He would take the goods, and then they would never see any money in return. This article goes into detail about what all he swindled. And the monetary amounts was thousands of dollars when it was said and done in that time. But all of these companies get angry and send people to collect the actual goods back. And when they go to get them, they can't find them. So it's the same routine of he's hidden them. There was even one account where he had ordered a wall safe and they had delivered it and never paid for it, but he put it in the wall. And so when the company demanded the safe back, he told them that they could have it, but it was bricked up in the wall and they had to get it. And the safe was never collected. But it takes them quite a while to figure out where the items actually are. And it's not until a couple of guys that work there, they get information out of them that there's false walls and secret passageways and all of these hiding spots. Holmes has even somehow, during the process of construction on the third floor, managed to build in a room in between the second and third floors. And this is where a lot of the actual items are. And they talk about the only way to get to this room is to go through the kitchen, get in the dumbwaiter, go up through the dumbwaiter to get in the room, and then to get out, you had to put a ladder up to the dumbwaiter to get back in the dumbwaiter to come back down. So it's quite a lot of work to get in and out of this room, and especially to get all these goods and furniture in and out of the room. So it's around this time that rumors start going on about what Holmes is really up to in this place. And in 1894, the Chicago police actually have reason to search his building and go in while he's not there. And while they're in there, they not only search the first and second floors, but they search this unfinished third floor and also the basement. And on the third floor, they find hinged walls, false walls and partitions, rooms linked together by hidden passages, airtight rooms that Holmes actually had hooked up to gas pipes and would use as gas chambers. They also find lots of hallways that go nowhere, lots of trapdoors, and especially trapdoors in the floor that have chutes in them that go all the way down to the basement. And in the basement, they find acid vats, lots of quicklime, they find a crematorium, and they find multiple tables that he used for dissection of the bodies. And so the authorities realized that there's probably something more going on here than just mere insurance fraud. And it's shortly after this, in the summer of 1894, that Holmes leaves Chicago. While researching this, just trying to get a timeline of events and his movements and trying to corroborate facts and different aspects of this case was so difficult. Even though there's a lot of it reported in the papers, the myth and legends surrounding this, the imagination ran wild. And this is also the time of yellow journalism, so sensationalism is the best method of getting people to buy papers. So it's said that Holmes had anywhere from 9 victims to over 200 victims. And there are differing lists anywhere you try to look. So I tried to focus on the victims that I could verify that he killed. And that's the list of names that you're seeing here now. The first name on the list, Minnie Williams, we'll come back to in a second. The next woman, Julia Smith Connor, was a mistress of Holmes's. Her husband had gotten a job in Holmes's drugstore, and he quickly struck up an affair with her. When the husband got wise to the affair, he left her and her daughter with Holmes. The last time Julia or her daughter Pearl are seen is Christmas Eve of 1891. There's been speculation that Julia may have been pregnant with Holmes's child, and he claimed that she died in an abortion procedure, whether or not he was the one that performed that, because he was a medical doctor, or if he did that just to murder her. There was Emmeline Segrand, who, after accepting a job in Holmes's drugstore with his business, was wooed by Holmes and then never seen again. A woman named Edna Van Tassel. I had also found where her name was reportedly Edna Van Tassend, and so that was another thing. Even the spellings of the names aren't consistent. And then we have several members of the Peitzel family, or Pitzel. I found it spelled several ways. So when Holmes leaves Chicago in the summer of 1894, he goes to Fort Worth, Texas. And there he goes to the land that he had inherited from the Williams sisters. And this was the first name on our list, Minnie Williams. And there's conflicting stories about how and when they met. But supposedly, Minnie Williams had become Holmes's personal stenographer. And during the course of their working relationship, they had struck up a personal relationship. And he convinces Williams to transfer land that she owns into his name, or rather an alias of his that he uses. And so once Holmes gets possession of the land deed, he actually ends up transferring it to Benjamin Pitzel. One of the last accounts of anybody seeing Minnie Williams alive was in Chicago in 1893. Annie Williams had gone to visit her sister Minnie and what she thought was her new husband. But after July 1893, neither one of them are ever seen again. Benjamin Pitzel, like Holmes, had a criminal past, but he was a carpenter by trade. And he ends up meeting Holmes at the Chemical Bank building in Chicago. Supposedly, Pitzel was exhibiting there. I wasn't able to find a lot of details on that, but they somehow hit it off. And Pitzel ends up becoming Holmes's accomplice in most of his crimes and said to have been most of the murders as well. So Holmes left Chicago in the summer of 1894. He ends up going to Fort Worth, Texas. And it's there that he has land that he had gotten the Williams sisters to sign over to him. And when they had disappeared, he inherited that land. And he gets arrested in July of 1894 on charges of selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis. And while he's in jail there, he meets a man named Marion Hedgepeth, who's serving a 25-year sentence. And they hit it off, they strike up a conversation, and they come up with a plan, much like Holmes had in his med school days, to fake his own death and collect a life insurance policy for $10,000. So they try this, and the plan is a spectacular failure. The insurance company actually became suspicious and refused to pay out the money to Holmes, or his pseudonym that was trying to collect. So Holmes decides he'll try it again, but this time with Benjamin Pitezel. He convinces Pitezel to allow him to fake his death, and they end up in Philadelphia. And it's there that Pitezel is supposed to be going under the pseudonym B.F. Perry, who is a scientist, and they decide that as a scientist, he will die in a fiery explosion in a lab. And Holmes was supposed to provide the corpse to put up to collect the insurance money. But during the course of these events, Holmes decides that he's actually going to kill Pitezel instead of just come up with a random cadaver. And so the story was that Holmes chloroformed Pitezel and then set him on fire. However, when they did forensics on Pitezel's body, it showed that he was actually set on fire and then chloroformed post-mortem. And this was supposedly to cover Holmes's tracks in case the insurance company got suspicious and decided not to pay out again. But he is successful in collecting the insurance money. However, Pitezel has a wife and family. But as we know, Holmes was notorious for beguiling women and taking advantage of them and generally just toying with them and treating them badly. And this is what he does with Pitezel's wife. He tells her that he's still alive, but he's hiding. And so somehow he convinces her to go with him throughout the country looking for Pitezel. But at the same time, he also is able to convince her to give him custody of 3 of their 5 children. And so you have this bizarre trip that they all take, Holmes jumping back and forth between traveling with her and traveling with the children. He essentially takes them on parallel paths through the United States up to Canada. And also, if this wasn't complicated enough, he's also staying with his own wife on and off during this trip and traveling with her. And this part of the story, just like all the others that concern Holmes, does not have a happy ending. At one point it is said that the Pitezel children and their mother are mere blocks away while he's keeping them separate and taking them through the states. The 2 daughters that he has custody with, he ends up locking them inside a trunk that he has hooked up to gas and kills them that way. This was a smaller version of some of the rooms that he had set up in his murder castle. He buries their bodies in his rental house in Toronto. And his movements are really pretty difficult to keep track of. He seems to just pop up randomly, different places throughout different times. But during this time that he's traveling with the Pitezels, Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police picks up this case and starts tracking him. Holmes ends up killing the 3rd Pitezel child in Indianapolis. And again, rental houses play a big part in this. The 3rd child's remains are actually found in the house's fireplace. He had tried to dispose of the body that way. But it's Detective Geyer that discovers this. However, Holmes isn't arrested until 1894, November actually, when he is tracked down by the Pinkertons and arrested on charges of horse theft out of Texas. That's what ends up bringing him down. But in 1895, the bodies of the Pitezel girls buried in the cellar of Holmes's rental are discovered. And that's when the web of stories and lies of H.H. Holmes really starts to unravel. The same year, 1895, Holmes's building in Chicago burns down. The only accounts of what happened is that 2 men were allegedly seen entering the back of the building late at night. They were in there for about a half hour before they're seen exiting. And when the building, after the building burns, as the police are investigating, they find a gas can under the steps. And the building is not destroyed completely, and some of the structure is actually intact and is used until 1938 when it is torn down. There's actually a post office there now on the spot. So Holmes is charged with Pitezel's murder, and he's found guilty and sentenced to hang. And while Holmes is in jail, he takes this opportunity to write his memoir. And I will link that down below. It is actually available from the Library of Congress. It's generally believed that everything he wrote, or just about everything he wrote in there, is completely made up. And I don't know that it's worth a read, but it was interesting to flip through, and he even had pasted newspaper articles in the back of it. But while he's awaiting execution, Hearst's newspaper approaches him wanting a full confession and offers to pay him $7,500 for the exclusive rights to his confession. And so he agreed, and he confesses to 27 murders taking place throughout the country. And it's from his time in jail waiting execution that the rumors about him maybe being a devil or maybe being possessed by the devil start to arise. And he himself is quoted as saying he's beginning to look more and more like the devil. He goes on to elaborate, "I was born with evil standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since." And finally, on May 7th, 1896, at the Philadelphia County Prison, the noose is put around Holmes's neck. And it's here that Holmes requests that his coffin be buried 10 feet down and encased in cement, ironically because he was worried about his body being stolen and dissected. It took anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes for Holmes to die because his neck didn't break when he dropped through the floor. So he strangled to death. Now, throughout time, as I've mentioned throughout this, legend and myth surrounded Holmes throughout his life, and that was true in death as well. It was rumored that Holmes had somehow managed to escape his execution, and this became such a prolific story that finally in 2017, his body is exhumed by Dr. Samantha Cox and her archaeology team from the Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. They're also aided by Holmes's son, his original son that he had had with Clara, aided by his great-grandson in exhuming the body and getting permission for the university. And so Dr. Cox had allotted several days to go on the dig to exhume Holmes's body. And as they dig further and further down, they do run into some structural issues. The weather gives them trouble. But they finally dig down and find a pine box. When they open it up, there's nothing in it. And so they start to panic, and they're on the last day that they have for the exhumation. So they're getting nervous. They decide to keep digging. And as they get further down, they hit a cement sarcophagus. So Dr. Cox manages to break through the cement, and what she sees inside is a little bit different than most bodies that are exhumed. Because he was encased in cement, his body didn't decompose in the usual way a body would. His clothing was nearly perfectly intact, except that he wasn't wearing pants, which may seem odd, but it was thought that when Holmes was hanged, he may have soiled himself, and the pants were then removed before he was buried. His mustache was perfectly intact. However, when the oxygen hit it, it did begin to flake away. And so that's why if you look at any of the photos, you won't see any of the mustache. But just as she had broken through and she's seeing Holmes's body, it had begun to rain, and the walls of the grave had begun to crumble. And so Dr. Cox panicked, and she grabbed Holmes's skull and was able to get that out of the grave before the walls started to kind of collapse. They were able to exhume the rest of him, but after trying so hard and so long to find him, were worried that they were going to lose the whole dig, and so that's why she grabbed his skull. But they take it back to the lab, and Dr. Janet, and I'm not sure if it's Mong or Mongi, she is an anthropologist at the Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and she was able to verify that it was in fact H.H. Holmes by his teeth. He had very specific gold inlay in his fillings, and they knew that he was missing all but one molar, and so they were able to verify that it was him, that he had not escaped his execution, and they reburied him and put the myth of H.H. Holmes back to rest. So in researching Holmes and his crimes and murders, you can't help but also research the legacy that his actions left behind. His crimes would impact Chicago's history and shape it, showcasing that Chicago was fertile ground for all kinds of debauchery and bad behavior. And this would be true into the turn of the century in the 20s. It impacted law enforcement. They realized that they needed a way to track people if they went across state lines committing crimes. I had read a little bit about how Holmes impacted the medical profession, and there were more strict regulations put in place for doctors. This could have been true in Chicago, but it's not really until much later in 1910 with the Flexner Report that medical colleges are held to a higher standard because the quality of physicians that many of them were turning out were less than suitable. And Holmes, no doubt, or the idea of the type of person that Holmes was, would shape literature and entertainment for years to come. If you're interested in reading about Holmes, I highly recommend Erik Larson's Devil in the White City, the White City being the Columbian Exposition, which allowed Holmes to move about the city doing the things that he was because the attention was turned elsewhere at the time. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about the true crimes of H.H. Holmes. Please join us next month for another True Crime Time. And if you'd like to learn more about St. Joseph's connection to the Chicago World's Fair or the Columbian Exposition of 1893, then check out the link down below to our History Speaks, where I talked about the Columbian Exposition with the curator of the St. Joseph Museums, Trevor Tutt. And in that, you will hear about notable St. Joseph characters such as Eugene Field and Mary Alicia Owen and Mary Proctor. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or Jen Wildhagen. She organizes this program every month. Our contact information is right here. So thank you so much for your time.